The young advocate, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, returned to India in the autumn of 1896. He was then a qualified barrister, aged almost 20, and devoted to the liberalism he had absorbed from Gladstone, Morley, and Dadabhai Naoroji. English had become his chief language, and it remained so, for he never mastered Urdu. Even when he was leading the Muslims into freedom, he had to define the terms of their emancipation in an alien tongue. His clothes also remained English until the last years of his life, when he adopted the sherwani and shalwar of the Muslim gentleman, and his manner of address was English. He had already assumed the habit, which he never gave up, of shaking his finger at his listener and saying, "My dear fellow, you do not understand." When he arrived back in Karachi, Jinnah must have felt like a stranger among his own people. His mother was dead, also his child wife, who could not have contributed much to his experience of human relationships, and his father had lost whatever little fortune he had saved. Jinnah was perhaps ill at ease within the confines of the 2 rooms in Newnham Road, nor was there much help or encouragement for him as a young barrister seeking clients. During 4 years, Jinnah had been absorbed into the life of London. He had talked with scholars, and he had heard the great voices in Westminster, busy with the riddles of government. He had listened also to the young reformers, lively with new ideas. He might have been alarmed as he tried to resume his old habits in Karachi, a town devoted to trade and shipping and small talk. His hands, spread so eagerly towards life in London, were now tied for lack of opportunity. There is one story, often told but never verified, that he was offered work in a law office, on the understanding that he married the lawyer's daughter. He was aloof from such shabby bargaining. He left the depressing sands of Karachi for Bombay, with its high court, its tradition in the law, and all the sweets of opportunity to attract an ambitious young man. Muhammad Ali Jinnah sailed for Bombay in 1897, but he was to endure 3 more years of penury and disappointment before he began to climb. Mr. M.H. Sayeed, who was Jinnah's secretary in later years, has written of this lean time. The first 3 years were of great hardship, and although he attended his office regularly every day, he wandered without a single brief. The long and crowded footpaths of Bombay may, if they could only speak, bear testimony to a young pedestrian pacing them every morning from his new abode, a humble locality in the city to his office in the fort, and every evening back again to his apartments after a weary, toilsome day spent in anxious expectation. At the turn of the century, Jinnah's fortunes changed through the kindness of the acting Advocate General of Bombay, John Molesworth Macpherson, who invited the young lawyer to work in his chambers. Mrs. Naidu wrote of this as a courteous concession, the first of its kind ever extended to an Indian, which Jinnah remembered as a beacon of hope in the dark distress of his early struggles. Early in 1900, there was a vacancy for a presidency magistrate in Bombay, an office that required generous recommendation. Jinnah was hopeful, and he was also enterprising. He sat, gazing through a window, smoking a cigarette, wondering what he could do. A cab passed by, and an idea struck him. He jumped into the cab and drove straight to the office of Sir Charles Ollivant, the then member in charge of the Judicial Department. Jinnah went in and asked for the appointment. He obtained the necessary recommendation from Mr. Macpherson, and within a few weeks he became a temporary presidency magistrate. The material struggle was over. Now he earned enough money to buy a carriage, to move to a better apartment, and to bring his sister, Fatima, from Karachi, and send her to the Bandra convent school. Bombay was a maze of caste and religious distinctions, and it was therefore a brave innovation to send a young Muslim girl to a Catholic convent. An anonymous author recalled the circumstances of this early gesture of Jinnah to his sister in a magazine article written 50 years later. In those days, the people of her community could not be reconciled to the idea of her joining the convent as a boarder. Many efforts were made to dissuade her from doing so. There was a regular hue and cry. The dovecotes of orthodoxy went up in flutters. The innocent young Fatima became the target for wagging tongues. We are told, in this flourish of words, that Miss Jinnah's brother was at her side to give all the courage that she needed to stand up to the opposition that had come from the torch-bearers of orthodoxy. Jinnah drove to the convent to arrange for his sister to be admitted. He went with her on an inspection round of the school premises, and when she had settled down to her studies, he used to visit her every Sunday, travelling all the way from Bombay to Bandra on horseback. The relationship between brother and sister endured through the vicissitudes of half a century, to the day of Jinnah's public tribute to her after the creation of Pakistan, when he said, "My sister was like a bright ray of light and hope whenever I came back home and met her. Anxieties would have been much greater and my health much worse, but for the restraint imposed by her. She alone kept a place in his cautious affections, from the childhood days in Newnham Road to the years of his triumph. Although Pakistan and India were irrevocably divided, largely through Muhammad Ali Jinnah's imagination and persistence, he is still remembered with respect among the older Hindu lawyers of Bombay. In the heart of the city is the lofty Victorian Gothic building where Jinnah began to practice soon after his term as temporary presidency magistrate ended in November 1900. Two splendid policemen in gold and blue turbans stand before an iron cage in which the prisoners are kept. Beyond them is a big, dark office in which some 20 lawyers' clerks tap out the wisdom of their masters on 20 typewriters. It was in this room that Jinnah began his career as an advocate 54 years ago. In another room along the passage sits an old man who can remember Jinnah's first arrival at his chambers, which he filled with furniture more splendid than anyone else would afford. The old advocate was very willing to talk of these early days. He said, "I expect you know the story of Jinnah at the beginning of his career, of his answer when Sir Charles Ollivant offered him a permanent appointment at 1,500 rupees a month. Jinnah refused and said he expected to make that sum every day. Oh yes, he had a lot of brass and dash, but he was right. Once he was established, he probably earned more than any other lawyer in Bombay." The advocate then summoned 2 friends from a neighbouring office, and all 3, in turn, told their stories of Jinnah. The second of them had known him when he was still rather poor. "But," he said, "his clothes were always his great distinction. He was even more independent in those lean years than he was later on. But he was so scrupulously honest. Difficult. Oh yes. Although I have never heard of his doing an injustice or a shady act, it was not in his nature." The third advocate then said, "Of course, you know the story of how the real turn came in Jinnah's fortunes. In 1903, the president of the municipal corporation was a Scotsman, James MacDonald. He was a very important man, manager of all the affairs of the Bombay Corporation. There was a big case being tried in the High Court, and the place was so full that the doors had to be closed. Inside the court was an enclosure reserved for the lawyers. When Jinnah arrived, he was quite unknown then, there was nowhere for him to sit. He saw that James MacDonald was occupying one of the chairs reserved for the lawyers, and he asked him to move. Naturally, he refused, so Jinnah went to the clerk of the court and demanded that MacDonald be removed. The clerk was reluctant, until Jinnah threatened to appeal to the judge. Then the wretched clerk simply had to go and ask MacDonald to yield up his place to Jinnah. MacDonald must have been an unusual sort of man. Instead of being furious, he gave up his chair, asked Jinnah's name, and soon after appointed him to act for the corporation for a fee of 1,000 rupees a month. The second advocate interrupted. Jinnah's faith in himself was incredible. You must have read the story of his reply to the judge who said to him, "Mr. Jinnah, remember that you are not addressing a third-class magistrate." Jinnah answered, My lord, allow me to warn you that you are not addressing a third-class pleader. And that reminds me of the nice story of a rich Hindu landowner who protested at the amount of Jinnah's fee. He replied, "You can't travel in a Pullman on a third-class ticket." The third old gentleman spoke again. "Oh, I remember him once when I was collecting for a relief fund. I went up to him in the bar library and handed him the subscription list. He took it, placed his monocle in his eye, read the list, handed it back to me, and said, 'I'm not interested.'" The second advocate resumed his story. He said, "You must realize that Jinnah was a great pleader, although not equally gifted as a lawyer. He had to be briefed with care, but once he had grasped the facts of a case, there was no one to touch him in legal argument. He was what God made him, not what he made himself. God made him a great pleader. He had a sixth sense he could see around corners. That is where his talents lay. When you examine what he said, you realize that he was a very clear thinker, though he in-iced the polish that a university education would have given him. But he drove his points home, points chosen with exquisite selection, slow delivery, word by word. It was all pure, cold logic." The first advocate then told another story. One of the younger men practicing at that time, younger than Jinnah, was M.A. Somji, who became a High Court judge. They were appearing as opposed counsel in a case which was suddenly called on for hearing. Mr. Somji was in another court at the time, and the solicitor instructing him asked Jinnah to agree to a short adjournment. Jinnah refused. The solicitor then appealed to the judge, who saw no objection, provided Jinnah would agree. But Jinnah would not agree. He stood up and said, "My learned friend should have anticipated this, and he should have asked me personally for an adjournment." Jinnah's arrogance would have destroyed a man of less will and talent. Some of us used to resent his insolent manner, his overbearing ways, and what seemed to be lack of kindness. But no one could deny his power of argument. When he stood up in court, slowly looking towards the judge, placing his monocle in his eye, with the sense of timing you would expect from an actor, he became omnipotent. Yes, that is the word, omnipotent. "Maybe," said the third advocate, "but always with Jinnah one comes back to his honesty. Once, when a client was referred to him, the solicitor mentioned that the man had limited money with which to fight the suit. Nevertheless, Jinnah took it up. He lost, but he still had faith in the case, and he said that it should be taken to the appeal court. The solicitor again mentioned that his client had no money. Jinnah pressed him to defray certain of the appeal expenses out of his own pocket and promised to fight the case without any fee for himself. This time he won, but when the solicitor offered him a fee, Jinnah refused, arguing that he had accepted the case on the condition that there was no fee. "I'll tell you another story along that line," said the second advocate. "There was a client who was so pleased with Jinnah's services in a case that he sent him an additional fee. Jinnah returned it with a note. 'This is the amount you paid me. This was the fee. Here is the balance.' When the three lawyers were asked, 'Did you merely admire Jinnah, or did any of you become fond of him?' one of them answered, 'Yes, I was genuinely fond of him because of his sense of justice, and because, with all the differences and bitterness of political life, I believe he was a man without malice. Hard, maybe, but without malice.'" Two of the advocates who spoke of Jinnah were Hindus. One was a Parsi. Some time later, a veteran Muslim barrister gave his different, perhaps more penetrating impression of Jinnah's work at the bar. "One must realize," he said, "that when he began to practice, he was the solitary Muslim barrister of the time. There may have been one or two others, but they did not amount to a row of pins. This was in a profession made up mostly of Hindus and Parseks. Perhaps they were over-critical of a Muslim who came from business stock, setting up such a standard of industry. There was no pleasure in Jinnah's life. There were no interests beyond his work. He labored at his briefs day and night. I can see him now, slim as a reed, always frowning, always in a hurry. There was never a whisper of gossip about his private habits. He was a hard-working, celibate, and not very gracious young man, much too serious to attract friends. A figure like that invites criticism, especially in the lazy East, where we find it easier to forgive a man for his faults than for his virtues. I can just remember Jinnah's first big chance in 1907 in what came to be known as the Caucus case. This arose out of a petition filed by certain citizens in Bombay alleging that the municipal corporation elections had been rigged by a caucus of Europeans with the object of defeating Sir Ferozeshah Mehta, of keeping him out of the council. Sir Ferozeshah Mehta was a Parsi, an elder statesman of the Congress, much respected and with great influence in the local administration. At that time, Jinnah was working in Sir Ferozeshah Mehta's chambers. He was appointed by the petitioners to act for them in securing annulment of the elections. The case was lost, but Jinnah gained great prestige for the way he handled it. As the Americans say, he made the headlines for the first time. And also, it was a great compliment to his talents that he had been chosen to state the case of Sir Ferozeshah, himself a distinguished barrister. This was the first of many instances when Jinnah was trusted by an older man, a man who was wise enough to see past the defense of arrogance, for I am sure it was only a defense, into the source of Jinnah's very real talents. As to the accusation that he was a brilliant advocate but a poor lawyer, it is easy for lawyers who lack the talent to plead to accuse the men they are obliged to brief of having scant knowledge of the law. I would put that down to human nature. Jinnah knew his law all right. I admit that Jinnah's methods were sometimes extraordinary. A judge once asked him to speak up. "We cannot hear you, Mr. Jinnah," he said. Jinnah replied, "I am a barrister, not an actor." The judge was patient, but he had to interrupt again. "Mr. Jinnah, I must ask you to speak louder." Jinnah answered, "If you will remove that pile of books in front of you, you might be able to hear what I have to say." I can tell you other such stories, but there is an explanation for them in Jinnah's strange character. I think his apparent rudeness was linked with his deep honesty. This may be difficult to believe, but you must relate Jinnah's integrity to the wholly different ethics of the life surrounding him, in a land where private ethics are rather shaky. There was a well-known businessman, Haji Abdul Karim, who had to appear in court on a serious charge. He went to Jinnah and asked him how much it would cost to take up the case. Jinnah answered bluntly, 500 rupees a day. The businessman was cautious and he asked, "How long will the case go on? I have 5,000 rupees with me. Will you accept this to cover the whole of your fees?" Jinnah answered, "I am not prepared to accept this amount. 500 rupees a day is my fee, and you must engage me on these terms or find another lawyer." Abdul Karim accepted the terms, and Jinnah won the case in 3 days. He accepted his fee of 1,500 rupees with good grace. "There is another story," concluded the barrister, "concerning myself. Although I once or twice acted as magistrate in cases where Jinnah appeared before me, I was actually his junior in years. My father was related to Jinnah's family, and at the beginning of my career, when I returned to Bombay from Gray's Inn, my father took me to Jinnah at his chambers. He said, 'Here is my son, make him as brilliant as you are.' Jinnah's answer was typical. He said to my father, 'Your son can come and work in my chambers, but he must make his own brilliance by himself.' During these years of Jinnah's early success as a lawyer, he met Mrs. Sarojini Naidu, the first sophisticated, intelligent woman to observe his talents, to see beyond the arrogance of the young advocate. She wrote of him, "Never was there a nature whose outer qualities provided so complete an antithesis of its inner worth. Tall and stately, but thin to the point of emaciation, languid and luxurious of habit, Muhammad Ali Jinnah's attenuated form is the deceptive sheath of a spirit of exceptional vitality and endurance. Somewhat formal and fastidious, and a little aloof and imperious of manner, the calm hauteur of his accustomed reserve but masks, for those who know him, a naive and eager humanity, an intuition quick and tender as a woman's, a humour gay and winning as a child's. Preeminently rational and practical, discreet and dispassionate in his estimate and acceptance of life, the obvious sanity and serenity of his worldly wisdom effectually disguise a shy and splendid idealism, which is the very essence of the man. Mrs. Naidu's warm regard for Jinnah was shared by many other young women who saw, as pride, what his lawyer friends called arrogance. Among them was an old Parsi lady, still living on Malabar Hill, who remembers Jinnah at the age of 28. She has said of him, "Oh yes, he had charm, and he was a good-looking. Mind you, I am sure he was aware of his charm. He knew his own strength. But when he came into a room, he would bother to pay a compliment, to say, 'What a beautiful sari.' Women will forgive pride or even arrogance in a man like that.